I've got not one, but two amazing guests for you on today's show. We're talking all about the carb load with registered dietitian Travis Wilson from the intro clip and our own coach Andie Cozzarelli. It's hard to believe, but we're already getting close to the spring racing season. It's especially hard to believe where I am in Toronto because the snowbanks are only just starting to melt, but believe it or not, spring is on the way. And if you've got races coming up in the half marathon or longer, it's time to start thinking about nailing your carb load. I find it really hard to get this right, since you want to maximize your glycogen stores, but it's also hard to avoid feeling bloated or nauseous from all the extra fuel. Both of my guests have experiences coaching countless athletes through this process and give you their best insights on when to start your carb load, how much to eat, and picking the right foods that will work for you. We're going to get into the science a little bit, but this is really more about finding the best strategy for your body. If you're thinking about carb loading for the first time, or if you struggle to get this right, or really, even if you just love talking about food, this is the perfect episode for you. So let's get started. All right, it feels really weird to have this as a podcast topic already, but we are at the time of year for the carb load, and I'm so excited to have Coach Andie and registered dietitian Travis Wilson here with us. Thank you both for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Corey.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I feel like it's such a privilege because when I first had the idea for a podcast about carb loading, I was kind of torn. Like, do I make this about the training? Do I make it about how to really dial in the nutrition and the science? And I figured what better way to do the podcast than to cover both.
Yeah, there's definitely components that rely on both pieces. So I think this is going to be good conversation for sure.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think you can't really have one without the other.
100%. Travis, I think most of our listeners will probably be familiar with Andie from some other podcasts, but do you want to give yourself a quick introduction?
Yeah, I would love to. So, as Corey mentioned, I am a registered dietitian. Mostly specialize in body composition or optimization of body composition, and I work with a company called MetPro, where we work with the general public all the way to elite athletes. So, currently, I'm studying for my board certification in sport dietetics, and I'm also a certified strength conditioning specialist. And I've been doing some personal training for about 13, 14 years. So, good background in all things fitness, nutrition, and performance.
Awesome. And do you have experience with the carb load in your own either training or running?
No, actually, this is my well, the podcast. I have not listened to your podcast to be transparent, but yes, I have done some carb loading myself, and then certainly with the athletes that I work with, that's absolutely an aspect of what we do and making sure that their nutrition is spot on for any events that they have.
Awesome. And what about you, Andie? Do you look forward to the carb load or do you dread it?
Um, that's a great question. I feel like I like carbs, so I feel like I kind of enjoy it. I think though sometimes it can be a little bit anxiety producing because I think a lot of runners can get stuck in this mindset. I think I probably get this way of like, am I eating enough carbs? Am I eating too much carbs? Am I balancing everything right? Am I eating too much in general? And so I think that can be, and I know a lot of runners struggle with that of trying to figure out what that balance looks like. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I find it's kind of like overlaid with the stress of the taper typically in a cycle where it's the same thing with rest. You kind of look forward to it, but then you get a bit of those taper crazies mixed in.
Yeah, because I mean, even some of the carb load can cause a little bit of the taper. I mean, it can sometimes make you feel a little bit sluggish at times, and so it's really important to know what to expect on top of doing it right. So yeah.
Awesome. And I'd love to get into during the show a little bit more about how to make sure you're feeling fresh, feeling good, because I know it's so easy to feel lethargic. But let's start with why you would even want to carbo load. So, Travis, how much glycogen can your body store, and why is the carb load an essential part of making sure that you have enough energy when it comes to race day?
Yeah, absolutely. So it looks like muscle glycogen, or where we store carbohydrates in our body, is about 300 to 400 grams. Um, this is just on average for most people. Obviously, that varies. And you know, with carbohydrate loading, we can increase our muscle glycogen. So just ensuring that we have enough energy through endurance events. And again, this is events that are above 90 minutes is really when it's important. But in short answers, just to make sure that we have enough energy on board. And obviously, this is not the only way, and this is not the only consideration that we want, but it is an aspect of it.
Yeah, and one of the things I've always wondered is I've like heard that 90-minute rule before,
Mm.
but My thought is always that you probably burn through more carbs when you're racing hard. Does that apply to your other runs outside? Is 90 minutes a threshold, or does that change a little if you're running easy?
Yeah, I mean, so intensity level does matter when it comes to energy sources. Typically when our intensity levels are about moderate, 65% VO2 max, we're only using about half of the energy coming from carbohydrates. So the other half can come from fat stores, um, primarily. As an energy or intensity increases, that starts to shift. So 85% of VO2 max, then we start to shift to about 3/4 of all energy coming from carbohydrate sources. So, that is a consideration, but I think when we're talking about carb loading specifically, it's for endurance events in my experience. And I think that it's not always necessary either. If we are getting enough carbohydrates in a day-to-day basis, fueling through intra training appropriately, then carb loading might not be needed on just a normal training level. But then certainly longer endurance events, it can be helpful.
Yeah, and maybe rudimentary question here, but we know
Yeah.
our body has limited glycogen stores.
Hmm.
Runners, burn through it like a tank. We're constantly
Yeah.
running. Why not carb load for every run? Why should I not just be, popping open the gummies and snacking on pretzels all day, every day?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one, because we probably don't need it. Because again, if we are feeling appropriately throughout the days and the weeks, feeling enough during our run, if we are just constantly carb loading, then we run the risk of some GI distress. It's really difficult to get in the quantities of carbs that are actually recommended, which we can totally get into. And then you also run the risk of gaining weight during that process too. And that's a real consideration when we're thinking about, power to weight ratios and optimizing performances. We want to maintain body weight and composition through our training bouts. And so, that's where we want to really be strategic and, give our body exactly what it needs and no more.
Hmm. Just to stress test, like on a practical level, Andie, I wonder if you find this relatable, but for me, I'm always torn a little bit on the half marathon. I know for myself and for your times as well, you're below that 90-minute threshold, and I find I usually don't do a full carbo load, but I do find whether or not it's scientifically backed, I do tend to feel better when I eat a little bit more carbs, at least in kind of the day before. Is that something that you found?
Yeah, that's what I've always done is try to, eat a little bit more try to eat a little bit more carbohydrates going into it. Mostly, like you said, going the day before, but sometimes even just leading into a race, I tend to maybe eat a little bit more carbohydrate just because it's easy to digest. And so I think sometimes I want to have like simple, I don't want to be putting anything that's going to be too heavy in fiber right before a race. So I tend to start eating a little bit more bland is what I say, or boring. I remember one time a friend asked me if I wanted to get dinner before a marathon, and I was like, he gave me some restaurant recommendations, and then I was like, I want to go somewhere where I can just get like the most boring meal. I know that's not fun. So, yeah, I think that's even for a half. I sort of try to get pasta. I think for a while I was also doing like salmon and rice and something easy on the stomach, but yeah, I think still with that, with these longer events, you still want to somewhat have enough glycogen, enough energy there, even if it's not going to be something where you're going to be completely burning through your glycogen. Because I think part of all the glycogen that you have in your muscles, if you're when you're training and going through the week, you're going to be using that during the week, and so the carb load actually helps us top that off so that we reduce our training in order to make that happen. And so doing a little bit more even for prep for a half will ensure that we do have enough stores in there for whatever distance and however long it takes us. So, yeah.
I'm curious, when you guys have carb loaded for events, how much additional carbohydrates are you intaking, or what have you found to be a good sweet spot for yourselves?
I mean, I feel like for the half, I'm not necessarily thinking about it from a like a broken down standpoint. I think I'm very much on the side of trying to do it from a what it looks like on my plate standpoint. I'm like, maybe a little bit more carbs here.
Yeah.
For the marathon, it's definitely like a stepped approach of trying to transition a little bit more to carbohydrate and still ensuring I'm getting enough protein. So I always try
Hmm.
to continue to get enough protein. And one thing that I've struggled, and I would love to hear if you have any feedback or guidance on this, is sometimes, especially in like the higher hormone phases for female athletes, if you're craving a little bit more carbohydrate, you need a little bit more carbohydrate. So how does that impact things? That's something that I've always wondered as well. But also, I've found that I have to be careful with my carb intake a little bit at certain times, just because I have had some blood sugar issues in the past. So I just
Mm.
have to be mindful of it. And I think that can also be something that happens with some hormone variations that some women can get. And so I'd be curious too if you have feedback on that, Travis, at all.
Yeah, that's really curious. I guess my initial response would be to you're going to know your body better than anybody ever could. And so the fact that you feel that you may need a little bit more carbohydrate during those particular hormonal fluctuations, I think it's really important to implement that and then stress test it. See how your performance is, see how your body feels, and then be able to refine that over time. Because for some individuals, that might be the case. For others, in which I work with, that hasn't been the case, as far as, changing the carbohydrate intake based on, cycles. So I think that that's going to be really key. And I think that that goes, you know, when we think about these recommendations, and I would love to share what kind of the science says and how much, carbohydrates are recommended for carbohydrate loading. But these are just going to be general guidelines. This is, yes, maybe what is optimal on paper, but can the individual actually tolerate that? Do they have experience with that? And so meeting the individual where they're at, I think, is incredibly important, and being able to speak to the person that is in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I definitely have that. This is probably one of the weakest things that I feel like fueling wise is I think I don't think I've experimented enough with the
Mm,
carb load. And so I think
yeah.
that's something I'm still sort of working on figuring out what that balance is. But I have
Hmm.
had athletes who have felt like they almost overdid the carb load. Where they just never really kicked that sluggish feeling even on race
Yeah.
day, and they just kind of
Hmm.
never came back around, and they felt like maybe they went overdid the carbs and didn't have enough of some of the other sources, and or was it were they trying to get so many carbs in that they were overdoing the fuel intake
Hmm.
in general in those last few
Yeah.
days. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it's really hard to experiment with the carb load because typically when you're carb loading, that's before your goal race when you don't want to experiment.
oh yeah.
Hmm.
That's like the one rule they have: don't do anything new on race day or
Yeah.
race
Yeah.
week.
Exactly. And that's where I think the opportunity lies, just like you would, training physically, train for things nutritionally as well. Before one of your long runs on the weekend, maybe you start to implement or simulate what a carb load would look like on a race day. Just like you would do with intra running nutrition or, any endurance bout, start to implement those things prior to race day to assess tolerance. And then, you can train the gut just like you would, any other physical component of your body.
Yeah. And Travis, I can feel you just waiting to tell us the science here, so I don't want to hold you back any longer. So when is the
Totally.
optimal time to start your carb load and how much should you take
Hmm.
in? And as you're kind of sharing what the science says, I'd love it if you could
Yeah,
also maybe sprinkle in, based on your own experience working with athletes, what are those
sure.
areas that maybe you don't touch versus what are those areas that maybe you bend a little depending on your personal preference or how your body responds?
Totally. Well, it does seem that the current recommendations, we can have benefit from carbohydrate loading 24 to 36 hours prior to an event. It used to coincide with this like big training bout and then decrease the training while you increase the carbs. It doesn't seem that you need to do that. Actually, the evidence is pretty clear on that. And so in general, the recommendation is 36 to 48 hours prior to an event is when you want to increase carbohydrates. And the amount that you want to increase them to is about 10 to 12 grams per kilogram per day. And I don't know if you've ever ingested that many carbs, but for me, I'm about 190 pounds. It's like 800 grams of carbohydrates to 1,000 grams of carbohydrates. Like it's so much carbs. Um, and I have found that most people just don't tolerate that much. It's very difficult for everybody to get in that amount of carbohydrates, especially with, weekend warrior athletes, maybe non-elite type athletes where it's like they have other things that are important to them in life, and they can't just put all of their energy and effort into this thing. So again, going back to meeting the individual where they're at, it's like, okay, let's maybe start with half of that. Let's see how you tolerate that. It also, I think, depends on, the week leading up to. Typically, what I'll do is I'll try to have athletes in just higher carbohydrate intakes in general. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with kind of what the recommendations are of just like general carbohydrate intake for normal athletes. So that's something I could definitely share and dive into too. But yeah, I think that take that 10 to 12 grams per day, 48 hours prior to an event, and then assess it. Test it out during some practice rounds, see how you tolerate it, see what works, what doesn't, and then try to refine it over time.
Travis, I don't want it to be lost just how much carbs that is that you just described. So I want to draw a quick comparison here. So you said about 10 grams per kilogram of body weight. Is that right?
That's right.
So if I'm to compare that to gels, let's take somebody like an 80 kilogram male, that would be 800 grams of carbs. Most gels are probably about, 25 grams. So that's 4 per 100. Times that per 8, we're talking the equivalent of 32 gels in a day. That's wild.
Crazy. Absolutely.
So what do you eat to get that many carbs? Because obviously, you can't just be sucking down gels. It's that much harder when you're actually eating whole foods.
Totally. Yeah. I think, what can be really helpful is liquid nutrition. And again, this is carbohydrate loading to prepare for an event. This is not general health and how we probably should be eating most of the time, right? Most of the time we want complex carbohydrates, things that have fiber sources, things that keep our blood sugar relatively regulated throughout the day. But in these instances, it's like really whatever you can ingest that your GI tract tolerates. Juices, pure sugar, honey added to things, any of those simple, easy digesting types of carbohydrate sources that your body specifically tolerates well.
Yeah, I found for me personally, like I have used some liquids, but you've got me seriously questioning if I need to take in more because I probably have like, a couple bottles that are like, 100 calories, maybe 25 grams of carbs. You're talking a small fraction of the carbs you need in the day. And Andie, do you think you're getting that much during the carb load?
Oh, definitely not. Like I said, I think this is an area where I feel like I have some work to do. I think that my introduction to carb loading, right, was like you're in high school and the day before a 5K where you don't need to carb load, we'd have the pasta dinner and everyone would eat tons of pasta before a 5K, which is like so insignificant. It doesn't really do anything. If you're not eating enough carbs already to support a 5K, like we've got more problems. And so like learning more about the science behind it and being like, wow, this is a lot more than I thought and how important it is and all that stuff has been sort of just trying to figure out what's the right balance and how to actually do that. And because I've had my own issues with just under fueling and things like that, I try not to be too intense on calculating because that can give me a little bit too much thinking about it too much because that was a problem I used to have. And so for me, it's very much like, all right, I am just going to eat more carbs. And I have no recognition of like, all right, am I doing a good job of this? It's just more intuitive for me. And so that's where I'm definitely lacking. Like, yeah, it's good, I think, to have some of that intuitive practice involved because that's really where that feeling it is going to make a difference. So yeah, super interesting. I'm gonna need to get some more juices. I do really like apple juice, so let's do that.
There you go. Well, and two, what you could do, Andy, is like bring that intuitive amount and just start quantifying it. Maybe
Yeah.
don't change anything to start and just put some numbers behind it, and then you can objectively say, okay, I feel this way when I ingest X amount of carbohydrates as a carbohydrate load, and then you can always titrate from there.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's what I need to start doing. And I think it will be important for me to do, like you said, sort of actually structuring that into your training so that you do actually have some practice of doing it before, even like a key long run that you're doing in prep, like just
Hmm.
how we want to practice for race day and get,
Right.
you could even like have this 1 week be like trial race week,
Hmm.
and incorporate that, not just what you're going to wear and how
Yeah.
you're going to feel during and all those things. So
Hmm.
yeah,
No,
that's
I
what I'm
love
going to have
that.
to do.
That sounds like a lot more fun. I love the idea of just building in a week in the middle of a training cycle where you just eat all the carbs.
Oh yeah, sounds really great.
Tra- Travis, when you're in that phase where you're trying to carb load,
Hmm.
is there any need to get in like complex whole carbs? Like we're talking like whole wheat, more fibrous items, your veggies, or are you really just going for the simplest sugars, fastest digesting items that you can find?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want to decrease those complex carbohydrates, probably decrease fiber in general. It's I wouldn't necessarily say as a blanket statement you need to get in those things. You may find switching from a more complex carbohydrate dense diet to all simple carbohydrates that someone just doesn't tolerate it, from the GI standpoint. You know, Either direction, maybe they, have more constipation or on the other end of the spectrum. So I think that that's a real strong consideration. And the challenge is you're not going to know until you step into that space. Um, but no, I think from a physiological standpoint, a couple of days without fiber for the most part is not going to be super detrimental for most people most of the time. But again, there's always going to be those considerations where you want to make sure that the individual is tolerating that amount of carbohydrates, but then the types of carbohydrates too.
And do you need any variety? Like, say those 36, 48 hours, if I ate nothing but bagels or pretzels, do you think that's detrimental or is it really just whatever works for you?
No, if that's what you like and you want to eat that amount of bagels and pretzels and you don't get like palate fatigue where you just burnt out from eating those things, then have at it. At the end of it, all the carbohydrates are going to break down into the same end product anyways. And so really that's the consideration is how can we psychologically help the individual to get in that amount of carbohydrates. Most of the time that's not going to be from just eating 1,000 grams of carbs via bagels. It's probably going to be a variety of different sources.
Yeah. Andy, is that typically how you do your carb load or do you have any favorite foods during that time?
I am big on pretzels because I'm a pretty salty sweater, so they're also really easy to eat. So you can really put them away, but they're also a pretty simple carbohydrate. So I'm big on those. I also do like bagels. So that's another option. But I also cereal is like one of my favorites. I love cereal, so it's an easy go to for that kind of stuff. Um, and then I find that it's harder to start to fill in the gaps there a little bit more,
Mm.
and that's where I think I have a little bit of a struggle. But I try to make sure I'm still getting enough of that protein just to balance out, so I'm not just like, feeling like my blood sugar is just through the roof all the time. And so, but I think very similar to what he was talking about. I also so I'll start to think about my carb load the week of for sure, but I will look for more complex for the beginning of the week as I'm sort of in the process of trying to build that up and then starting to taper that off in the last 2 days. So I kind of at least have that down. But yeah, those are the kind of the things I look at. I mean, I recommend athletes with like oatmeal, things like that. And that's technically a more complex, but a lot of people's stomachs handle it really well
Mhm.
and feel good with it. And so that can also be a good option for people, especially for the morning. So.
What about the night before? You're going out for your pre-marathon meal. What are you ordering?
I normally like to get pasta, but like I said, rice too is something that I've done well with and felt really good with. Staying away from like cream-based sauces because when you do look at the carb load, you want to stay away from like greasy carbs that are going to be really high in fat because those will really irritate your stomach a lot more. So that's something I advise a lot of my clients away from. So I always think about that The Office when they're running the 5K and he's eating the fettuccine alfredo like right before. Like that's not what we want to be looking for. So I don't. That's not what I typically normally like something with a red sauce or an oil based sauce or something simple is what I kind of want. And, chicken, easy things that are going to be high in protein, not too high in fat. So yeah, potatoes, those are also good too.
Mm-hmm.
If
Yeah.
I have it my way, that'll now be the thumbnail for this video. Is just Michael Scott downing fettuccine alfredo.
Perfect.
Love it. Love it. Yeah.
Travis, are those the kind of foods you tend to recommend to your clients? Or are there any others that come up a lot?
Yeah, no, I think all of those are really great. And to Andy's point, fat can definitely irritate the GI tract. It also slows down digestion as well. So it might inhibit your ability to digest, absorb, and assimilate enough carbohydrates. So you can always pull down fats a little bit as those carbs come up. I think it's a super smart move to keep protein, right where it's at. Um, yeah, I mean, again, pastas, maybe switching from brown rice to white rice, potatoes. Yeah, I love oatmeal as well, quick cooking oats, anything like that. Um, maybe bananas or fruits that are easier to digest that don't have quite as much fiber. But then again, I think, add some honey to the oatmeal to increase carbohydrates without adding volume to your overall intake. Just easy, simple things like that could be, really helpful. But yeah, bland, again, things that you tolerate and you like, I think is a good call.
Yeah, I like that idea. Or something like maple syrup too. I find
Hmm.
like anything basically that you could have in gel form is a pretty easy way to
Yeah,
add calories.
exactly.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit in terms of like, why don't we just carb load all the time about like the potential for GI distress, but also
Mhm.
gaining weight. Like, are these things that you need to worry about during the carb load, or is there a reason why these are less of a concern when you get within those last 36 hours?
Yeah, I certainly don't think I would worry about it. I encourage my clients not to worry about it. Weight may come up a little bit, as we increase glycogen stores, we may retain a little bit of water. But again, these are all things that are really important for performance. And so you're going to be using all of this additional carbohydrate, energy, water as you go through your endurance event. So that weight will typically regulate itself and come right back down.
Yeah, especially when you've got a half marathon or marathon at the end of that carb load.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. And in terms of that scheduling, when you get to the time period where you're like deep in the taper, but before those last 48 hours, are you going to want to be adjusting your fueling at all? Or is it really just a matter of keep everything status quo until you get to that threshold and then it's kind of a light switch?
Yeah, for me, and what I like to do is I like to keep it relatively stable and I will assess weight. And as long as weight is staying relatively stable through that taper, I'll keep carbohydrates where they've been at when they were training a little bit more. Again, as long as they're tolerating it, no issues, weight is nice and stable, I really find no need, especially because we are going to be doing a large endurance event at the end of the week. So we want to keep carb intake as high as we can. However, if for whatever reason the taper is so much so that weight starts to come up, then yeah, potentially there's opportunity to bring carbs down just a little bit, just to level things out. But I think weight is a really good data point. There's some information that we certainly can extract from that. And so, that's typically what I'm using. And, going into it, my thought process is let's just keep it nice and stable through the taper. And then, then we can go through the carb load at the end of the week.
I find that to be one of the hardest pieces fueling wise is like you are changing everything else while trying to keep that stable. Like the long runs come down, the intensity maybe comes down just a little bit. Sometimes even the frequency, I might drop one run a week in that taper. It's hard to keep everything the same, and sometimes you feel a little wonky. Andy, do you
Mhm.
have any strategies to either like, keep in touch, being used to digesting gels or taking in carbs and stuff like that when you're in that kind of weird in between period where you're deep in the taper but not yet carb loading?
Yeah, I think that it's good to always keep relatively close to what you've been doing, just because I think it's good for us to just have those touch points to, and because the body's pretty adaptive, so we want to make sure that it's still staying in that same ability to be able to digest those carbs while running. Still practicing sort of how that feels, making sure that the gels feel good. So I think it's something you can continue to do through the taper. And like Travis said, like we're getting still that's also contributing to our carb load. So yeah, I try to encourage the athletes I work with to just try to keep things as normal as possible. Eat to your hunger levels too, because if you are finding yourself hungrier, even though you're dropping some of the exercise, it may be that your body still is needing that for some extra recovery. So I sort of am kind of try to keep them on that side of things. Like, okay, yeah, if you're feeling a little bit more hungry, like keep fueling to what your hunger levels are saying, because we want to make sure you are fully recovered going into the race. We don't want to then start to shortchange the benefits of the taper just because we're kind of stressed about something about eating too much or too little or doing those things. We really want to make sure that we are recovered, or the taper really doesn't have the benefit that we're going for. So yeah, I try to say, keep things as simple and consistent, and then just listen to your body as much as possible. So
And how do you walk that balance? Like I think it sounds simple. It's like, follow the science and get the right amount of carbs, but also, don't think too much and worry about it. It's really hard in practice. Maybe this is a question for either one of you, but like, how do you nail that down?
yeah, I know that this is also a challenge for a lot of people, because we all have different abilities to be perceptive of that kind of stuff. So I think because I was under fueling and then I had to switch it over, I had to get really good at being able to be more intuitive about how, like, if I was hungry and listen to my hunger cues. And so I've gotten a lot better at being like, okay, if I'm hungry and I don't want to continue to be hungry for like hours by eating like a small thing every 5 minutes, like I need to have about this many calories or this much food at this point in time, and that satisfies my hunger. And so I'm trying to always go based on that. And so I'll eat my meals when I normally would eat them, like first thing in the morning, and then after I run, and then when I'm hungry for lunch, I'll eat and try to eat a normal sized portion so that I'm not kind of constantly feeling hungry throughout the day. And that's helped me. And then like if I find myself hungry, I'll have the afternoon snack. If I'm not, then I just you just kind of continue and make dinner, and then you eat again. So that's what's helped me. I don't know if Travis has some any additional sort of guidance that he's worked with clients on, but
Yeah.
that's how I've done it, because I have gotten pretty good at the intuitive
hmm
eating.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think that awareness piece is so key. It's super impactful and important. And I think the more you can develop that skill, then the easier it gets, and then you can kind of adjust on the fly. I think maybe for the individuals that haven't had that opportunity to develop that, working with a coach, I think it's so valuable to have, somebody else guiding that process, somebody that has been taking individuals through that process, that has that background knowledge to kind of guide you through the nuances of, the training block, the tapering, the carb load, all of the ins and outs. And then through that process, you can work with the individual to work on those cues, work on what hunger and fullness feels like when their body is feeling like they are needing a little bit more fuel. So I think that that's probably the most impactful people or thing for most people, is just outsourcing that, having somebody to guide that process for them.
Cool. And in terms of like outsourcing it, like, are you working really closely with your athletes during that time in the taper, or is it really just a matter of like beforehand kind of talking through what that looks like?
Both, and all of the above. Yeah, it's, certainly talking about it ahead of time, okay, this is kind of what our game plan is, obviously based on several different variables and factors. This is what we'll adjust if this happens. So just really instilling confidence, I think, is the biggest thing. And then being able to communicate consistently during that week, or just on a weekly basis in general, to see how they are feeling, and taking both the objective and the subjective measurements, collecting all that data, and then discussing, okay, what I think is our best next moves, and how do you feel with that? let's chat through this because you're the one that's actually going to be implementing it. And I want to make sure that you're on board and any questions that you have are answered. You feel confident moving forward.
And what do you do when athletes have stuff that tend to work for them, but that maybe go against the grain or don't tend to line up with the science? Do you automatically trust the athlete's instinct, or do you try to steer them in a certain direction?
No, I think it's again kind of going back to the beginning of this podcast, and it's like Andie is going to know her body better than I ever could. And so I think I do have to trust that, especially if they are, an intermediate or advanced athlete and they've been doing it for some time. It's like obviously it's gotten them to a specific place. So like let's use that and leverage it. And in our conversations, maybe I can pick up on some gaps, either gaps in knowledge or things that they haven't tried. And we can say, okay, cool, this has worked really well. Can we just fine tune it or tweak it this way? And let's see what happens. And sometimes it works really great. Sometimes it's like, nope, that actually didn't work. Okay, cool. Let's just take that out and go back to the drawing board or continue to do what we were doing.
And is that pretty much what you're doing on the other end? Like, as these athletes are working with a nutrition coach, are you doing the same thing for their training?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly what he was talking about too, with like having a coach to get through this. I think is really important because it just helps to take the mindset out of it, so that the stress isn't there about the, oh, am I eating too much or too little or doing all those things. Like I think that really helps. But then, yeah, on the other side of things, there's definitely has to be a give and take on how we approach the taper in general, because at the end of the day, if the athlete, there's so much psychology behind things working, that if you're thinking that what you're doing nutritionally isn't working, you're going to be stressed about it. And like we know stress impacts the gut. So if that's happening, we're going to see that happen on race day, and it's just not going to work for us. So like I think there has to be a good balance of recognizing, hey, what does the athlete think and what do they know, and then having that sort of conversation of like, let's try to find that right balance between what we know works and then also what they know works, and so that we're both confident in what we do as we get closer to race day. So yeah.
And then, like, training wise, in those last couple of days, are runners at that point pretty much on autopilot close to the race, or is there still kind of the same type of tweaking and nuance that you might have on the nutritional side?
You mean like so yeah, like the last few days of training? Is that what you're talking about? Like the last few days when we're
Yes, the
like
last few
really carb
days, or
loading?
even like the last 2 days when you're in those 48 hours. Because, like, I
Yeah.
think most training plans don't call for you to take time completely off, but you obviously don't want to kill yourself.
Yeah. That I think that's one of those things that I have to kind of be making sure that people are holding themselves back, so that we're not making these runs too hard, that we are going to end up utilizing some of our glycogen that we're trying to save up, right? Like if you go and do a really hard run a couple days out, like what is that going to look like for not only your performance but also the nutrition? And then Travis will be able to comment on that better. But like if you were to run I see runners also their legs start to feel better, like they're tapering, and then they start to try to explore that fitness a little bit, and you're like, nope, we need to hold that back so that the legs are ready for the race day. We do have a race week workout that helps keep us sharp and have that muscle coordination in place. But in the days before, we're not gaining any fitness. So I just really want those days to be the help for us to really ensure that we're topped off glycogen wise, and that we're also rested and ready to go for race day, and that we can see our fitness expressed on race day and not the day before.
Yeah, I think it's really hard because you're just like, you're so well rested, and then you have all this extra energy from all these carbs. I think, like, you just want to go out and go for a long run, but you really have to resist it and save it all for race day.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the last few days is holding people back from, doing something crazy. And, that's, I mean, I think I always have to remind them like, hey, yeah, no, this is what we're doing this for. So just enjoy today, find ways to relax and, don't take some of that energy out in the run itself. It's that easy run the day before the race is really just to make sure the legs are primed. It's actually better to run the day before the race than to take it off. So utilize that and it'll benefit you.
Yeah. I think I've definitely had my own struggles during the carb load, and I've talked about some of them, but I think there's a lot of ways that you can go wrong. I'd love to kind of go through different types of fueling struggles that runners experience and maybe hear both your thoughts on some potential solutions, certainly from a fueling perspective, but also if there's anything else. The one I want to start with, just because we've kind of already talked about this, is like if you find that during the carb load you're feeling bloating and lethargic and those kind of things, how can you maybe tweak it to make sure that you're getting in those carbs but addressing that issue? And Travis, maybe if you want to start with more
Mhm.
the science or your perspective on how to nail down the carb load on that piece.
Yeah, definitely. I think it would be important to look at what are your current sources that you're ingesting and seeing if you can identify any culprits that might be causing that. Especially if you have experience with carb loading in the past and if you tolerate it, maybe this time you're doing things a little bit different, see what those differences are. And then potentially opting for carbohydrates for a fact that you tolerate really well. And maybe that does mean, okay, now we are limiting the amount of types that we're ingesting, and we're just sticking to a couple key carbohydrate sources that that you tolerate really well. So I think, again, getting to the root cause and trying to figure out what is causing it. For some people, it might be quantity. And quite honestly, I would rather somebody decrease the amount of carbohydrates and have better GI function and not have that bloated ickiness associated with it than try to force those carbohydrates. Because when you're having those experiences, whether it's bloating, GI distress, constipation, etc., your body's absorption, digestion, assimilation, that is altered. And so the likelihood that you're actually getting in all of those carbohydrates may not be the case. And so I'd rather get somebody's gut feeling better first before I push more carbohydrates.
Okay, and Andie, is that something that you've struggled with at all?
Not, I wouldn't say, I don't think I've had a lot of issues with, just feeling like I've overdone it really. Um, so I mean, I don't think I could comment too much on that, but, yeah, I've kind of always been though, uh, like just kind of thought about what things have worked in the past. And then I just stick to doing the same things, as boring as it is. It's just like, okay, this has worked. I know this has worked and I should just I don't need to try anything new, and you don't need to go get the latest thing that's on the market just because it's out there to try it. And this is really just a standpoint where it's like what we've done and what we've practiced is most important. And yeah, if something doesn't feel right, then adjust it and go from there. So
And what if we go to the opposite extreme? So, like, bloating, often you're taking too much complex carbs or you're just eating too much altogether. What about if you find that you're hitting the wall constantly in races? How do you maybe tweak the carb load, or maybe you're just your general nutrition, if that's the case?
yeah, yeah. I mean, as a coach, I kind of look at it as I think that's the hardest thing I think in the marathon is when you're bonking, like what is behind it. And because the marathon is unique to, or the marathon in any longer event is unique to the point where you are running out of glycogen, you are sort of reaching these limits and what your body can absorb and all these things. There's just so many new variables introduced for why you could be bonking. And then I think one thing that I hadn't realized in my own training was I think that I wasn't necessarily having as much issue with my carb intake and more with my, well, partially absorption of the carbs. I was having some issues with my stomach at the time. But then I think I also was underdoing the electrolytes. And so that was a huge piece that I kept trying to put in more carbs, kept trying new things, different things. And it kept sort of getting this bonk. And I was like, I might be actually. And so I've noticed more now that I've experienced with electrolytes and how I kind of intake those, that I actually feel just more awake after long runs. I just feel a lot more energized. So like there's that component of it when we're looking at the carb load of what's not working. It could be something electrolyte related. So if you're bunking, we have to kind of consider all of those sources.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it is, a dance of all of these different parts, hydration, which is again not just water, but the electrolyte piece, and then certainly carbohydrate fueling. And I think that that's okay. Yes, what are those 2 days leading up to the race look like? What have you been ingesting up until that point? What is pre-race day or day of look like? And then what are you doing during that race too? Are we optimizing for all of those things? And I find that most people aren't. They're just not ingesting enough carbohydrates in general. For bouts of exercise or endurance, 1 to 2 hours, it's about 60 grams per hour of carbohydrates. Anything above about 2.5 hours, it's about 90 grams per hour, which is a significant amount of carbohydrates. And then we can look at sources. If we're just ingesting things that are glucose, we can absorb about 1 gram per minute. But if we're getting a mix of glucose and fructose, it's about 1.8 grams per minute. So we can look at those different types of sources to make sure that we're optimizing for as much fuel on board as possible. And so I think that that's really part of it too, is just taking people up to the maximum amount of fuel that they can ingest comfortably and then slowly pushing that over time.
All right, Travis, I want to go back to visualizing this in terms of gels and talk about this from a practical
Yeah,
standpoint. 'Cause
yeah.
you just threw out another number here,
hmm
90 grams an hour if you're taking over 2.5 hours. And for most marathoners, they're going to take over 2.5 hours. So
hmm
let's pick an average of, say, a 4-hour marathoner. You're looking at almost 4 gels an hour. That's
hmm
16 gels. How do you even carry that on you, let alone digest it?
Right. I think that's where aid stations, knowing what is going to be on, the course, what they're offering, getting familiar with those sources, making sure that you tolerate them. I think that that can be really helpful. Um, but you're right. Logistically, it does become a bit of a challenge. And so just trying to figure out best ways for you specifically. And, I know for some individuals, it's like they start to get palate fatigue and they just don't want to be ingesting that much, or they feel full and they don't want to be ingesting it, or it's early in the race and they don't feel like they need to be taking in their carbohydrates. It's like, if you don't do it early, you're never going to catch up later in the race when you actually need it. So it's practice. I think is the all of this comes down to is the more we can practice it outside of the race, the more we can start to step into that space. And on race day, there is no guesswork. We've already done it. We're already familiar with it, and we logistically know how to navigate that.
Yeah, I think personally, whenever I don't feel like taking a gel early in the race, I just remember how hard it is to take it later. Because
Yeah.
when you're 18, 20 miles in the race, that's the last thing you want to do is taking another gel.
hmm Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, a mix of things using both gels and then maybe even some liquid nutrition. I know some people just they can tolerate liquid nutrition. It goes down easier. You get some of your fluids in with it as well. So a combination, a mix of things can be helpful.
Yeah, I'm gonna bring up what's a pet peeve of mine at races. It used to be like every race had Gatorade, which is fine and easy to prepare for. There's so many races now that will use like low calorie or 0 calorie electrolyte beverages. And it drives me crazy because if you're running a marathon, you need the carbs, and then you're forced to either carry it on you or rely entirely on gels.
hmm Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that's too. It's kind of like a double-edged sword because like, in some instances, it's like Gatorade, if you're using your Gatorade for your electrolytes, it's hard to get enough electrolyte. And then people end up drinking too much Gatorade and have too much carbs coming in. So it's like, oh yeah, it's like, that's better because it's less for you to carry because you can take that carb source during, but then at the same time, it's like, well, then you also need to be packing your electrolytes probably to make sure you're still getting enough there.
Yep.
Yeah, I feel like it's hard but yeah, you kind of have to end up figuring out the best way to get it all in, whether you pack your own or
hmm
whatever that looks like.
Yeah. And I think the other challenge is like the variables that you can't necessarily control, whether it's humidity, maybe the course has additional hills. And so your nutrition on one race day versus another is going to change. And so I don't know that it's ever going to be perfect. We can use these recommendations as guidelines, train, and then again, we just have to refine it over time and know that it's like get as close of approximation of what works for you on that given day. And then again, there's going to be those times where you just kind of have to dig deep and go for it, and making sure that the fueling is taken care of. But that's only one part of it. Like you also have to show it physically.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a good point, Travis, on the conditions. I mean, I think weather is hard to adjust for, but even the course, like I think
Mhm.
a lot of runners, myself included, I like to go like, okay, this is what I usually take in a marathon. But if it's a super hilly course, that's going to add time, which means you're burning more calories and need more energy.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, and then your heart rate is also getting up probably more as you climb the hills, which means you're probably switching over into carb burning quicker or more often. And so that's also going to affect how quickly you might also see you start to feel a little bit close to the edge. So
Hmm.
even more
Yep.
so getting your carbs in early and often.
Yes.
Yeah.
What about if you're dealing with cramping is an issue? I don't know if this is something that either of you have dealt with in the past, but like I've heard it can be related to a lack of sodium, but then also too much sodium or too much liquid. So how do you figure out what the problem is and fix it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I tend to see that it happens more frequently with a lack thereof. And you can kind of probably tell where you're cramping. If you're cramping in your gut, then it could be too much, right? It's just too much load. But I tend to find that most people, most of the time, are just not ingesting enough electrolytes and fluids. And so that's where you can kind of assess. Again, are we within those recommendations? If we're way outside of those in either way, then that's a good place to start. But if we're kind of smack dab in the middle, we're within the recommendations, then we can kind of we field test it. What does it feel like if we do a little bit more electrolytes, a little bit more fluid under the same conditions? Okay, no cramping, perfect. That's what it was. I don't know that there's ever a way to like in that moment say this is it, unless we, have some more information as far as being way outside of those recommendations, or, uh, and I think a lot of individuals will know like, yeah, I just didn't drink enough water, or didn't get in enough electrolytes, or I didn't stick to the plan. So I think that that's probably the best way to approach it.
Yeah, and I'll add too that there is also a component of muscle fatigue cramping. So if you're checking all those boxes from an electrolyte standpoint, then sometimes it's actually that, and I think that we see this a lot more often in the hamstrings and sometimes in the calves as well, where it's could be like very subtle form shift that you started doing that was inefficient and putting more stress on the hamstrings. And so sometimes we see cramping from that perspective. So it's also important to recognize that and if you're always thinking it's my electrolytes that's causing this and you start taking in too much or you really make these drastic changes to try to
Mm-hmm.
fix it, then and if it's muscle and it's not really related to that, that's also something we want to be mindful of. So even in training, we'll kind of want to see if that's something that's happening, and adjust and figure out how we can do it to fix that, whether it be more strength training or a little bit more practice on, doing some hill sprints or something that's going to be activating and strengthening our ability to maintain good form when we get tired. So
Is that one of the benefits of throwing in hill sprints in a marathon training is cramping, or is there maybe a different reason for that?
I think that's one reason because it's just a biomechanical tool that helps us to ensure that we're getting used to being able to utilize good form. And but I think also, yeah, from the biomechanics standpoint, like if you're starting to lean forward from the waist, for instance, and that's something that some people start to do when they get tired going up hills or even on flat surfaces, they're doing it. And so just having that reinforcement of what that good form should feel like and doing that often does help us to have a little bit more power behind our stride, does help us to have a little bit more ability to kick that into gear when we need it. So yeah, I had read a blog from an athlete that they were doing really long runs at marathon pace to try to stop this hamstring cramping they were getting, and it turned out that didn't actually help, and he still kept happening. He still kept getting it, and then he actually was training for a 10K ahead of a marathon block, and when he went to the marathon block, he had better mechanics going into his marathon block from doing that 10K work and doing the speed work, and he didn't have the issues with the cramping. And so it could even just be biomechanical or strength thing that we need a little bit more time, not just spent running long distances at pace, like maybe even doing a little bit more of that work that gets the knees up to help us make sure that's there. So
Yeah, this is another reason that I love that we have you and Travis on together, because so many of these issues, it's hard to tell whether it's nutrition
Mm-hmm.
related or training related, and it's really bringing those two together where you find that happy balance.
yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like every athlete needs a Travis and then a coach that we're working with, because a running coach, because there's so many things that like I know the general guidelines
Mm-hmm.
on nutrition and how to help people figure out their fueling strategy, but these edge cases of athletes who are sort of on the one end of the spectrum, maybe they're like, I feel like I'm a salty sweater. What if they're outside the normal? And so
Mm-hmm.
then it's really hard for someone who's doesn't know the real intricacies of it to be able to give really helpful guidance on,
Yeah.
is it carbs, is it electrolytes, is it this? It's hard to really nail that part down. And so I always feel a little bit like helpless to help those people, because I'm like, I have no idea, like I don't know
Yeah.
enough. And so having someone like Travis be able to really nail that, dig into it is, I think, really
Yeah.
helpful.
I don't know, Andy. I think you seem to know quite a bit. I think one thing too is just like asking those questions, whoever you're working with, like ask those questions, because I would think that's where those answers lie.
Yeah.
I think that that will give you so much guidance as to, what is the appropriate response. And I think, I mean, even, I'm not an expert in nutrition. Like I know some things, I'm a dietitian, but there's certainly so many things that I don't know. But I think that yes, if you have a general understanding, like I think most of the time that's enough. There's always more information out there, but I think again, just asking those questions, digging a little bit deeper, getting a bit more understanding of who you're working with and who's in front of you, and then just like trusting that, you do know a lot of things, I think is really key.
Yeah.
Travis, I think I already kind of got this answer from Andie, but from a dietitian who's worked with countless athletes to provide nutrition recommendations, what would be your go-to meal the night before a race?
Well, okay, this might be the time in the podcast. In full transparency, I am not a runner. I do not run. I would consider myself a cyclist. I do a lot of mountain biking. So like big vision quest mountain backcountry mountain biking is like my go-to jam. Um my go-to like the night before.
Yeah, the night before any endurance event, really. So yeah,
Okay.
I'm
My
assuming here a morning event. So maybe if you're talking an evening event, we'll go like morning of, whichever you
okay.
prefer.
My go-to, and this is super basic, big bowl of oatmeal, ton of honey, protein powder, some almond milk, maybe some blueberries in there. But I know that I digest it well. It tastes yummy, and I
Is
can
this for
eat a
dinner?
ton of it. This could be for dinner. Yes, this
I
could
love
absolutely
that.
be, and I could be so content with that for dinner.
Yeah, that sounds good. I honestly feel like I've been rethinking. I'm like, maybe I should just eat pancakes the night before a race. Like, why not? I love pancakes, love
Right.
breakfast.
Nobody is saying that dinner actually has to be like a dinner food, right?
Yeah.
It could be
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah.
I respect it. Like Andie, you brought up the idea of cereal. One of my favorite things in the days leading up is like dry cereal because it's so easy to just snack on it throughout the day.
Oh yeah. I mean, I already kind of sometimes will do like a bowl of cereal when I'm hungry at night. I'll be like, oh, I'll just go get some cereal
Yep.
and then go to bed. So that could just
Cereal,
be.
cereal with a little protein powder in it, get your
Yep.
protein needs met. It's great.
Yep.
A little
That was
chocolate
I
actually,
milk.
yeah.
I
That
love the running community. It's like oatmeal the night before, and then by 10 a.m. we're drinking beer at the finish line.
The biking community is not so different.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I know. I
Yeah.
used to do cereal when I was working in an office. I used to do cereal with protein powder, and I'd bring it with me to the office and have that post workout or post run.
Yes. Love it.
Yeah.
What is your guys' go-to cereal?
I
Oof.
always
Favorite
mix
cereal?
my cereals. I mix like I like to mix different ones together. So I like to get a protein cereal. Um, and then lately, like my husband really likes Cheerios, and now I've been like, oh yeah, Cheerios are good. Cheerios are good. I hadn't eaten those in a while.
Yeah.
And then I get some like there's some flakes that I get. I have celiac, so I have to
Okay.
sort of pick and choose what I can eat. But
Hmm.
yeah. How about you, Corey?
I'm big on anything crunchy, especially because a lot of the time I actually use my cereals as like granola. So like I'll put it on yogurt or even on like oatmeal and stuff. So if you've heard of Vector, I really like that one. Or like oatmeal crisp, honey bunches of oats, like anything that has like, flaky, crispy stuff that you can sprinkle on
Hmm.
top. But if it's like a snack where I'm just trying to get in sugar, then cinnamon toast crunch is probably the guilty pleasure.
Oh, I do
There you
miss
go.
that one.
So good.
Yeah.
So good.
Oh.
You have a favorite cereal, Travis?
Um, yeah, Raisin Bran, actually.
No
Yeah.
way.
Love Raisin Bran with no sugar added on it. I don't know. Like that's like speaks to the old man in me, I suppose. But it's for whatever reason, I find it delicious.
Oh, love it.
And are you having this straight up, like just with milk, or are you adding anything in?
No, typically just milk, like almond milk with it. Yeah, no, I won't typically add any sugar or anything to it. Um, I don't know, blueberries maybe. Yeah,
All right.
yeah,
I'm
no.
impressed. That's a well-balanced meal.
Yeah, it's not bad, right? For as far as cereal goes. Yeah,
Yeah,
Is
for
it too
real.
much fiber for the carb load?
it might be. I would go with more some Captain Crunch for the carb load.
Captain
Ooh,
Crunch, nice.
classic.
It's worth noting that we're recording this. I think we're all on Easter time at like past 8 p.m. and talking about cereal, so this is ideal timing too.
For
Yeah,
sure. It's time to eat our cereal before bed.
exactly.
Oh.
Man, I think I'm feeling pretty motivated at this point to just get in all the carbs, and honestly, I know I'm gonna be kind of dreading it and worried about the bloating and stuff when I'm there, but I'm looking forward to the carb load at this point. So Andie and Travis, thanks for joining me and giving some new inspiration for snacks and especially breakfast for dinner.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Corey.